Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Institute for Government. For those of you who haven't been here before, I recognise a number of familiar faces, so welcome back. My name is Peter Riddell. I'm the director of the Institute. This is the fourth event in our Women's Leaders series, which has been focusing on how women contribute positively to government, business and public life in the UK and around the world. We had an event looking at the role of MPs. We had another on women leaders in organisations, and some of you were here last month when we had Cathy Ashton, the High Representative, I should say, for foreign policy and security policy, who came from Kiev, Brussels, and on her way to Tehran here. I'm very glad to say our guest speaker today, Philippa Roe, has a little smaller distance to come from across the park. I think from my office we can actually see the tower. And this series, which we'll carry on, is essentially to look at how women exercise leadership, how they get there, the pressures they face, the innovations they've done. And we're very glad to be doing this series in conjunction with EY, and they've been strong supporters on that. Now, to introduce Philippa Roe, she's the leader of Westminster City Council. She's the 11th leader of the council, and she's one of the 15% of UK council leaders who are women. It's, even though it's not an innovation, it's only 15%. And I think that's heavily skewed towards metropolitan areas, actually. It's quite interesting. Philippa's career began in business, particularly in financial services, and then before entering politics, she was also advising the Tory party on the private finance panel, reflecting her own experience in financial services, and heading the Treasury team on the James Committee. She was elected to Westminster City Council, actually not that long ago, 2006, and held a couple of cabinet posts there, and was elected leader of the council in March 2012. So you actually did it slightly slower than David Cameron did from entering the Commons to becoming opposition leader. I think only by a couple of months you were, but nonetheless it's a pretty fast rise. Westminster Council is a very interesting council, not only because we're in the middle of it now, physically sitting here, but also because it's been a long tradition of being an innovator in council practice, and with extraordinarily unusual circumstances. I remember vividly one of the MPs for City of London Westminster, Peter Brook, bumping into him during a general election campaign, and he wasn't wearing a rosette. And I said, Peter, well, why aren't you wearing a rosette? He said, and we were on just outside the Palace of Westminster. He said, how many people around here do you think are my voters? And that, in a sense, is a curious dilemma that the Westminster Council faces. A very large number more people come through Westminster, work here, like people in this building, than are actually residents and voters. And it's one of the very unusual, I mean, leaving aside the City of London, it must in a technical sense, be unique in that. It's one of the three London councils merging some of its staff. Philippa and I were just talking about that before, on various functions with Hammersmith and Fulham and Kensington and Chelsea. Westminster has been praised by Eric Pickles for its council tax record, but there's been criticism over parking charges, cuts to services and rent levels. So it's a controversial job, it's an innovatory job, and it's a fascinating, well before the local elections start. I was delighted we will be able to welcome Philippa here to talk about her own role as a leader, and then we can broaden it out. I'll ask her some questions, and then we'll broaden it out into some questions from the audience here. So, Philippa.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you this afternoon. The subject of gender inequality in the workplace is something that's interested me quite a lot for some while, and I think that largely comes from the very diverse career background that I've had. When I left university, I went into the PR industry, which was very female-dominated. Later on in my career, I went into the city, which was very male-dominated. And now I'm in local politics, which, while far from perfect, is actually much better balanced. When I was in the city, it was very clear to me and a number of other women that there were very few senior women within almost any institutions across the city. And I teamed up with another senior colleague and decided to hold a women's conference within our organisation to look at what the issues were that were holding women back and why we were not making more progress, and try and work through some of the solutions. And it was very interesting. We had a piece of research presented to us where they'd taken two groups, mixed groups, both of whom quite genuinely said that there was not a prejudiced bone in their body at all, they didn't discriminate at all, and they were given two CVs of somebody called Alex, and they were told that this person was going for a very senior job within the organisation. And one group were told that he was a man, and the other group was told that he was a woman. Surprise, surprise, the group that thought he was a man was significantly more positive about this individual for the role. And when we started to look at why that was, it was about the fact that the qualities associated with someone who was going to be senior within that organisation were more normally associated with the qualities that men have. So it was a sort of subliminal prejudice that was going on here, which is much, much more difficult to tackle. We also found that women were not terribly good at selling themselves. I remember clearly from my time in the city, several colleagues of mine going around crowing about their brilliance and how they'd done this deal, even if they hadn't, constantly saying how wonderful they were, and of course they got promoted. Whereas the women were much more self-conscious, much more worried about whether they were doing a good job, much more introspective, and actually much more realistic about how good or badly they were doing, and never blew their own trumpet. And they tended to be overlooked. We also found that the adage that women don't help each other was actually true, but I don't think that it was because women were being competitive, which one's normally told is the reason for it. It was actually because we were in a very cutthroat environment and everyone was working incredibly hard, and there simply wasn't the time to turn round and look to try and help somebody else. But in fact, the main reason, I think, why there were fewer women in senior management within the city organisation was that the city life is very incompatible, totally incompatible, really, with a proper family life, which is what I myself felt. And I left the city on the birth of my twins 8.5 years ago, and I went into local politics. When I was in the city, I was working often 40 hours on the trot to close a deal. That would be on top of having worked for months, from sort of very early in the morning till 9, 10, 11, often midnight, working weekends. And I knew that I would just never see my kids if I stayed there. So I went into local politics, and it was completely different. I was, first of all, a backbench councillor when they were tiny, and I did most of my work remotely from home on my BlackBerry while the kids were playing away or having a swimming lesson or whatever it was. Occasionally I had to go into City Hall for a meeting, which was fine. I was quite late to motherhood, and I soon found my natural habitat was around a meeting table rather than changing nappies. It was quite a nice respite to go off and do that, and it was actually very rewarding. Then when they went to school, I became a cabinet member, and cabinet members don't have offices in City Hall. And again, I worked a lot remotely. I had more meetings, but I could juggle most of those during the day when they were at school. Then a couple of years ago, I became leader, and that is more arduous, more hard work, but I enjoy it a lot. And I do have an office in City Hall, so I drop the kids at school into the office by 8:15. I leave at 4 o'clock, go and pick them up, take them home, do the homework, give them their supper. Then I go back out at 7 and work till about 9:30 to complete the day in the meetings. And that flexibility allows me to be the sort of mother that I want to be, but also to have an incredibly rewarding job. And I think it's one of the reasons why the council work and being councillors does attract more women. About a third of the councillors across Britain are women, but only about 15% of council leaders are women. And that equates, it's quite close to city boards, which are about 12%. What is interesting also is the speed of change. Research that was done that if you look at the third of councillors that are women, it will take 150 years on the current speed of change to get to 50-50. Whereas if you look at city boards, which start at 12%, it'll take 70 years to get to 50-50. Still far too long, but nevertheless quicker. In Westminster, 37% of our councillors are women, and around my cabinet table, 4 of the 12 are women. And that's about proportionate. Having said that, that is not deliberate. Those women sitting around that table are there purely on merit. They were the best people for the job. We have a senior executive board, which is the officers that help run the council, and that's about 50-50. And again, that is purely on merit. That's not a deliberate desire to have some sort of equality statement at all. Martha Stewart said, I never pay attention to age or gender. There are just too many more other important things to consider. That should be the way that it is, and I hope in Westminster it is, because I think we are very open and diverse, but it is not the case more broadly. And that is really to the detriment of organisations and to businesses. Throughout my career, I've sat on a number of boards and committees, a few of which have been all women, a large number have been all men and me, and quite a few have been mixed. And I can honestly say that the best decisions and the best problem solving happened in the boards that were mixed. And I think that is because women and men approach problems very differently, and they have a different way that they process and work around issues. And neither one is better. What is great is the combination of the two coming together, and that broader way of working through problems tend to end up in better results. Deloitte's produced a report in 2011 that looked at European businesses, and they showed that those that had women in senior management produced 10% higher returns. Betty Spence, who's president of the National Association of Female Executives, said, if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman Brothers and sisters, we probably wouldn't have had our financial meltdown. And, you know, she may well be right. But there are some very good arguments to get more women in politics. Margaret Thatcher's classic quote is that any woman who understands the problem of running a home will be nearer to answering the problems of running the country. But there are more arguments. Firstly, just fairness. I mean, it's, you know, it is simply fair that women should have the same crack of the whip in politics and indeed any other career as men do. But more pragmatically, women do have a different interests, different perspectives and different experiences, and woe betide the party that doesn't take that into account. 51% of the electorate is actually female, and they are more likely to vote for the party that recognises their issues in their policies, and actually they are more sympathetic to the things that are worrying women and the things that they need. I also think that more women in politics may actually help with the running of some of our big national institutions. But so what are the sort of barriers to women coming into particularly local politics? I actually think they're very similar to the ones that we found when I was in the city. Still today, the majority of domestic chores, particularly looking after children, are undertaken by women. Which is, and you know, given that it's actually, you know, we all want to get to the balance where women and men can offer the same thing, but we're a long way from persuading men to actually take up equal parts of the chores in the home. I think there's also still the indirect discrimination, the Alex CV that I talked about earlier. I think that is there, not so much in central London and maybe some other central urban areas, but I think the statistics worldwide, although a third of the councillors are women, with only 15% being leaders, I think that shows some form of discrimination at some level. Having said that, in central London, the 8 London boroughs that make up central London, currently 3 of the leaders are women, and recently there was a very short period where 4 were women. That was 50-50, so it is very different in urban areas. But it's interesting that more women are not backbench councillors, and I think one of the issues is women putting their name forward to actually do the job. We're coming up to elections in May, and so over the past year I've been going through the sort of selection process for sort of candidates. And by far and away the majority of people who put their name forward are men. Which is, you know, is interesting. I mean, the majority of mothers, and we talked earlier of my own experience about how being a councillor is great, got great flexibility for if you're a mother. The majority of mothers say they want to work, but only 12% want to work full time. And of course, being a councillor, which is an incredibly rewarding job, would be a good way of doing something, you know, very stimulating that would help. I think that there's an enormous untapped pool of very talented women out there who've given up work because they've had children. Some of them have had some tremendously successful careers. And I think business as well as politics needs to look at having sort of flexible arrangements to actually draw them back into the workplace. And I think there is this lack of knowledge out there about how flexible councils can be and how you can work your timetable around your home needs. But I think more than that, I think generally across the country there is a lack of interest in politics, and that goes for men and women. But women are even less likely to vote than men. So, you know, what are we going to do to improve the situation? I think it starts in schools with educating people about the value of politics in their lives and just how important it is to become involved. Firstly, to vote, but then after that, to actually put themselves forward and get involved. And as well as educating people about how flexible it can be, particularly women around their home sites, but also how rewarding it is. In my time in politics, I've spoken to politicians of all shades, and just about all of them have said that they've gone in because they want to put something back. And there's no better place to do that in local government, much more so actually than being an MP, because the services that really matter to people day to day are actually delivered by local authorities, be that adult social care, housing, clean streets, safe streets, public health. All those things are delivered by local authorities. And as a backbench councillor, when you're dealing with the issues that your residents have, helping to sort them out, that can be incredibly rewarding. As a cabinet member, when you're looking more strategically at the way we deliver services, you can truly change people's lives. And that can really make you feel great about the work that you're doing and makes it an incredibly rewarding place to be. I also think that there are too few role models in local government. We've had Margaret Thatcher for national government, we have Theresa May, and there are a number of national female figures that are out there. Local government generally doesn't have anything like the same profile. I think it's even harder to get a female noticed in local government. And without those role models, I think it's harder to attract women to come into local government. There's quite a lot that's being done on training and mentoring, which is important. There's a wonderful organisation called Women to Win who do work for parliamentary candidates, female parliamentary candidates, helping them with the selection process, presentation skills, speech skills, Q&A skills, those sorts of things. And the Local Government Association is starting to do the same sort of thing. But what I am absolutely not pro, and many in this room may disagree, is quotas and all-women shortlists. We have some incredibly talented and able women, and how demeaning is it when someone has got themselves a job and it happens to be through an all-women shortlist to be told you only got it because you were a woman. There may be circumstances in extremis where the proportions of women are so tiny and the prejudice is so great where something dramatic has to be done like that. But in general, particularly in local government where I don't think the issue is so enormous, I think quotas are the wrong route. Other people have a different perspective. In Ireland, 30% of all candidates have to be women, and in Belgium, it's 40%. When writing this speech, I was looked back over my 8 years in politics, and I thought to myself, have I been discriminated against? And I can honestly say the answer is no. Even when I was going for leader, it never crossed my mind that being a woman would be a disadvantage. And I think that's because local government, particularly in central urban areas, is much more supportive of women than many other business areas.
Thank you very much indeed, Philippa. Lots of questions out of that, lots and lots of questions. You mentioned at the end local government more supportive, and you talked about flexibility for a working mother, and as you describe it to yourself with your twins and so on. But isn't one of the issues not just gender but age? That how many of your colleagues are your age, or in fact, aren't rather a large number of them quite a bit older?
Actually, quite a lot younger. We have a huge age span within the council. I think it's one of our strengths at Westminster Council. There are some that are older. There are lots, with children. And there are lots that are younger as well. We have traditionally been seen as a bit of a stepping stone for Parliament, and that has tended to attract some of the younger people in. But I think we have a complete cross-section.
No, because one of the, it goes back to your time point, because the time thing works against, say, men of your age on the whole becoming leaders, doesn't it?
Well, interestingly enough, we have quite a lot of men who work full-time and juggle being a councillor. And we have quite a lot of women who work full-time and juggle being a councillor. What we don't have is many women who juggle being a councillor, work and have kids, although we have men who juggle being a councillor, work and have kids, which I think goes back to the gender imbalance in the home. So I think the answer is that being a councillor can be quite flexible, and it's a question of making sure that when you have your meetings, which is what dictates the lack of flexibility, it's around people's real availability, which is why quite a lot of the meetings are in the evenings, which involve councillors, so it's after work or after the children have gone to bed. And if you're a cabinet member, you can decide when your meetings are during the day when they're at school. But if you're not and you've got a job, you can have all your meetings in the evenings. And a lot of work is done remotely, so you can do it from your desk in the office if you chose to, or if you're looking after children in the park. It would depend how you wanted to do it. So it is that flexibility that allows you to do it, like me to do it as a mother, that also allows men to do it who've got careers and women who've got careers.
Now, you mentioned at the end also the mentoring training. And our sense is that local government's way ahead of Parliament in that respect, that there have been a variety of initiatives for training and preparing councillors, I mean, of both sexes for leadership positions, which has been quite actively done, quite successfully done. And did you have any mentoring or training yourself?
No, I didn't actually. I suppose my sort of training was on the job throughout my career. There is mentoring and training that goes on, but certainly for women. I mean, Women to Women I mentioned, and they're a very good organisation. They do a lot of work training women to how to present themselves and how to get. It's really the selection process, which is getting women into the seat. But that's actually organised by the Conservative Party through central office. What I'm not aware of is what the other parties do, although I'm sure they have other things that are similar.
Yeah. I mean, on that point, what type, I mean, you mentioned that's the selection process, but quite a lot of you could argue what's needed, certainly you could argue in relation to Parliament, is just help to handle the conflicting demands of being a councillor. I mean, to learn to complexities of local government. I mean, you're dealing with a very big budget local authority, and all right, you had training in that because you worked in financial services, and therefore the big numbers didn't frighten you. But there is an extent to which a lot of councillors haven't been used to dealing with big budgets, and just purely understanding that, where induction and training can help in that respect.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the numbers is one aspect of it. I think that probably a bigger area is just how incredibly complex an organisation like Westminster is, and the multitude of different services that we provide, and being able to navigate your way through that as a new councillor. We are just looking at the moment at putting in place the training that we will offer all new councillors that come in after May. Because I think it is very important. When I became a councillor, I had a proper induction programme that took me through each department and what was going on, who to contact. And then we're going to offer each councillor a mentor so that they've got someone to ring up and say, I've got this resident with a problem, who do I call?
Yeah. And on that, which again, I mean, what Parliament does is much, much more limited than that.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, one thing you didn't mention, of course, is you do come from a political family.
I do, yes.
But you took a different route from your mother. She went to Westminster.
I did, yes, she did, yes, absolutely. She was MP for over 20 years while I was growing up. And I deliberately took a different route. I think Parliament has become more female-friendly or mother-friendly, family-friendly than it was in those days. But she was in the constituency every weekend. She was in Parliament voting every evening. And I found it quite difficult as a child, to have the sort of relationship with my mother that I would have liked, which is one of the reasons why I've steered myself into local politics, because I can have that flexibility. Now, Parliament has come on quite a long way since those days, and I know they've changed the hours and things, and so I think it is easier for women.
So in a sense, you partly reacted against your mother's experience during what effectively was the Thatcher era and the post-Thatcher era.
I suppose I did react against it. I mean, everyone chooses life is full of compromises, and everyone chooses where those compromises are. And mine were just slightly different from mother's, based on experience of my growing up.
Yeah. The other point is, I'm going to come back to the age thing in a different way. Is that, and you said that Westminster is quite often regarded as a stepping stone to the House of Commons, but you got involved after you'd already had a career.
Yes.
What is that true of all you mentioned younger councillors? Is that true of all of them? Isn't there a danger of, particularly around here, of the people who are working as special advisors or working for MPs, who by definition are going to be in this area, some of them residents and therefore can become councillors, becoming councillors a bit too young for their CVs rather than perhaps the long-term commitment?
Well, because being a councillor doesn't really pay anything very much, they all have careers as well.
Yeah.
So even the younger ones are working in various different fields, some linked to politics, some not. But we have a complete cross-section. There are people who have retired after successful careers, there are people in the middle of their successful careers, people who've had less successful careers or whatever. There's a complete cross-section of people within Westminster and indeed age ranges.
Now, the other thing is, as I mentioned in the introduction, Westminster, along with Wandsworth, have always been regarded, going back actually to the Thatcher era, when there were many fewer Conservative councillors than there are now. We'll see what there are after May. But as the vanguard councils for change, how much do you see yourself as part of that tradition of bring through innovation in local government because of the history going back to the 80s?
Very much so. I think times have changed quite dramatically in recent years. We've got the austerity programme we've been going through with Triborough that you mentioned. But we've got a lot further to do in innovating our services. We've had some very harsh cuts, and we've taken about £100 million out of our budget, but we've only got, that's only halfway. We've got another 100 million to take out. We are determined to preserve frontline services as much as we can. So that's one element where we've absolutely got to lead the field and be innovative. But in the other area, we need to look particularly at the West End and the growth opportunities that are there, and indeed the threats globally. And we need to be very innovative in how we take that forward. We've recently launched something called the West End Partnership, which brings together all sort of senior people with stakeholders across the West End, to try, and for two reasons. One is about creating a vision to try and make sure that we drive the West End, in the way that it needs to. In fact, we've got some lessons to learn from the city, I think. In about 2000 or thereabouts, they recognised the threat of Canary Wharf and totally changed that their planning, their other policies in order to counter that, and have seen very significant growth since then. I think we are now just starting to recognise the threats domestically and around other areas of London and also globally, and that we need to do something similar. So I think what we're hoping to come up with is quite a radical and innovative vision, which will be linked back to providing jobs for people in central London as well, so that local people actually benefit from all that growth.
Yeah, when you mention local people, the concept is quite different for you, because, as I mentioned in the introduction, the people, including in this room, in this building, we've got a few, I think, I know a number of your electorate, but not many, actually. And so that must create, it almost makes the borough, especially unusual, even more so than the City of London, is that you've got this range of business, of tourism, and so on, yet a very high percentage of people who actually benefit from your services aren't actually council taxpayers.
It's an enormous challenge for us. We have about 1 million visitors a day, and our population under the latest census is just over 200,000. And we don't get a penny for those visitors, despite the fact they have impacts on our clean streets, wear and tear, licensing, enforcement, planning, all those issues. It costs us about £50 million a year, which is unrecoverable to us. And then we've got Crossrail coming through. But that looks like it's going to bring about another 250 million people a year into Westminster, which is very, very significant. And this is one of the challenges that the West End Partnership is starting to look at, is how do we manage the impact of that, both in terms of funding what's needed, but also practical things like how do we disperse people from those stations to get to where they need to go, given the volumes. But it is a challenge, and we're speaking with central government about ways forward.
But the other thing, you're not homogenous borough, both at the north and in parts of the south, along the river. You've got quite a lot of deprivation. So in a sense, there is your critics would say, hold on, the poorer people in the borough tend to get ignored.
I would completely refute that. We do have some of the poorest wards in the country. We have a 17-year life expectancy difference between our poorest and our most affluent wards. We have one ward where 50% of the people are unemployed and 50% of those have mental health issues, but we're not ignoring it. We have some really extensive regeneration plans. What we're doing is we're using the value of our housing assets to regenerate the area, building not just more sort of affordable housing and social housing, but market housing to help fund it all, and also bringing into the area on the back of that economic regeneration. So we're building sort of incubator units, startup units, supporting local businesses, and we're hoping with the market units, not only does it help fund the regeneration, but bring people with spending power into the community, which will then help the local shops, etc. And there'll be more. We get a sort of virtuous circle. We're also putting in new health centres in and more open space, more usable open space and green space, etc., to try and tackle some of these intractable problems that have actually dogged parts of Westminster for many, many years. And we've done it very, very closely with our communities. They've actually worked up the plans with us. And then when we think we finalise them, we go to a vote. And if the communities say no, we don't do it. And we've had one of the very early votes did say no, but we've just had 3 successes going through, and we're about to go to a vote on a 4th.
Now, another aspect of the unusual nature of Westminster is, of course, a lot of the things which preoccupy you, talked about the West End Partnership, also involve the mayor. Now, in many other cities, actually, a lot of the things you do would be responsibility of the mayor, not of a kind of a council. And therefore, the tension, isn't there a sense of an unresolved aspect of the creation of the mayor's powers and the mayor wanting all the time to encroach on what you're doing? And that's almost irrespective. I'm not necessarily talking just about Boris, but I mean, the same might have been true of Ken Livingstone or whoever comes after Boris, whenever that would be.
I think inevitably there would be the potential for tension. I think it's the way you manage it. And I think if you're working very much in partnership with an agreed shared goal, then you can each contribute what you can contribute and work and push together for it. Inevitably, there's going to be discussions about who funds what, and budgets are tight. But I think that's a sort of a practical element of actually trying to work together for the greater good. And the GLA are sitting on the West End Partnership, and I sit on a number of bodies. I sit on the London Enterprise Partnership, Local Enterprise Partnership, and I sit on the London Crime Reduction Board, all of which are sort of the GLA bodies. And so I think that there is that sort of partnership working. We won't always agree on everything, but I think if we can keep that dialogue going, it can work very, very well. Yeah,
but there's also a difference in style of leadership. Do you sense that you're the leader of one of the wealthiest boroughs in London? Then you've got Boris with his total different style of leadership for the whole of London. Do you have a sense of feel of competition there?
I don't think competition, but I would pick up one thing. We're not one of the wealthiest. It's a misnomer. Westminster is wealthy insofar as it generates an enormous amount of money for central government. We collect double the amount of the business rates of the City of London. We are bigger for GVA than the City of London at £46 billion. We have, 700,000 jobs, 3,000 startups a year, etc. So we're incredibly important to the UK economy. So from that perspective, we are wealthy. Does the local council see any of that? No. So, and in fact, we've got these £50 million worth of unfunded costs that I was talking about earlier. So we as a council are not at all wealthy. And in fact, we suffer because people think we are. In terms of my style versus Boris's, actually, I don't think it's a question of style. I think it's a question of agreeing what you're doing. And I don't feel in any competition with Boris for taking centre stage. I couldn't win anyway, but so I don't feel any competition.
Could I get to the point you made earlier? You already made very large cuts. You've had to because of the cutting grant and so on and so forth. And you're going to have to make further ones. Could you explain a bit more, because it's very much the area we're interested in at the Institute for Government, of your kind of shared services work, because we look at it a lot in central government. How is it actually working out with Hammersmith and Fulham and Kensington and Chelsea?
Well, it's worked incredibly well.
What does it actually involve, and then how it's working out? Yeah.
Right. Well, we've co-located the three teams that were, and we've restructured into a sort of simpler management structure, which has taken out a lot of the senior management posts, which has meant that we've saved a lot of money. What has been very interesting is that we at Westminster always thought that we were the best at everything, of course, and we are a very good authority, but we found out to our surprise that actually there were one or two things that Kensington and Chelsea and Hammersmith and Fulham did slightly better than us, and indeed the things that we did better than them. So we've all learnt from each other, so there's been a very useful process of best practice. And I also think that in itself was a catalyst for broader thinking. So I genuinely believe that the service that we are now offering is better than it was before. We're delivering it at lower cost, and we're still able, because we've maintained political autonomy, to tweak the services to the needs of our three very different boroughs. So it's worked incredibly well.
How does that work out? Because that's exactly the question I want to ask. I mean, you've got shared services, but you've got different political control in one borough.
No, we're all Conservative.
No, you're always Conservative. So you're all Conservative now, but you may have. So you were when you were originally pre the last elections. There was pre the 2010 elections. There'd been differences.
Hammersmith were a Labour-controlled authority, but prior to Tri-Borough. So since you've been Tri-Borough, we've all been. But we, it is possible. One hopes not, but it is possible that one authority may go to another control. I don't think that will actually affect tri-borough.
So how can you tweak? I mean, that's the point I want to get onto. I mean, you might well have a different view from Kensington and Chelsea on what you want to do. And that's, you want to do that. But how does the tweaking work to reflect your political preferences as opposed to someone else's, which would be accentuated if post-Tri-Borough you had differences of political control?
Well, it's a little bit like contracting out, where the contractor has a number of different local authorities or indeed businesses that it works for. Each one has their own specification. So for it, a very basic example, if we decided that all our home visits for adult social care had to be half an hour, where Hamilton and Fulham wanted to be 20 minutes and Kensington and Chelsea wanted to be an hour, that would be all accommodatable. I mean, it would have different costs associated with it, and that would be fine because it all passed back to the local authority. So we are able to tweak the detail of the service on the ground, and indeed we do it differently. With the way we do our personal budgets and support our carers is different from the way that the other two boroughs do it.
What other services could it be done for?
Well, the obvious ones, which have taken longer to do because of the nature of existing contracts, are the sort of corporate services, which is where we're moving to now. That's everything from sort of back office finance through to sort of HR and legal and those sorts of things. It's possible that certain aspects of housing, particularly the service which brings people in and finds them housing, we call the housing option service, but it's dealing with the people who need housing, we might be able to get some savings there. So we are exploring other avenues, but it's worked so well that it's worth our while looking at other things. Yeah,
and what would that leave as the core? I mean, there is a sense here. What would be actually the core of an individual borough then?
Well, obviously, I think things like sort of the policy and the communications, those things are absolutely key to be core. Some aspects of the finance are absolutely core to a borough because that's central to what you can achieve. And then there are areas, for example, like the property portfolios that we hold, that are just simply, there are no savings to be made. There's no upside in doing it. If anything, it makes it more complicated. So there's two judgments I think one needs to make is, what is just simply politically not acceptable to push out to make tri-borough, and then what is it that actually the business case just does not stack up for doing it. In fact, in certain circumstances, it may even cost you more money. And we've been quite robust when we've been going through the tri-borough process to make sure that we see proper business cases before making the decision.
But there's another question, and I'll open it up for discussion, are there also things which you may have to cease doing? Because you mentioned, the classic problems are now adult and child care, which are the fundamental responsibilities of local authorities, however you define it, whatever happens in, say, education and so on. And are there any things which local government, not necessarily Westminster, but more generally, may have to reconsider whether it does any longer, given the likely trends of public spending and the in practice constraints on your revenue raising?
Yeah, I think as we go through the next 2 to 3 years, as we set the budgets, we need to look at everything. Our primary task is reletting contracts more efficiently, particularly using modern technology, moving people from wanting to have one-to-one interaction with individuals when they interact with the council to making it really easy for them to do it using modern technology, either on the internet or on their smartphone, for example. We've got a new website that we've just launched and a Report It Out where you can snap a picture of a broken paving stone and the system will automatically not just report it but tell you what's happening as it's being fixed. So there's no need for you to actually contact the council and speak to an individual. So there are things, that saves us a huge amount of money. So there's a huge amount that we can do, which we're going to do first, about changing the way that we do services. And the other thing that we've done, and I think there's a little bit more to do on it, is to re-engineer our services from the customer back. I think in government quite a lot, it doesn't have the same sort of market pressures as business. When you slightly tweak your service, you bolt something onto the side of it, leaving the initial structure in place. And over time, that becomes very unwieldy and no one ever takes a look at it. We've completely stripped that back. There's a lot of efficiencies that we've found. But we inevitably, we will go through the list and see, is there something that we will need to stop doing? It is an absolute last resort. I can't say that we won't get there because we haven't done the budget process yet for the next 2 or 3 years, but it will be an absolute last resort. And I very much hope that it won't be at the sort of adults and children's social care, because that's fundamental to people's quality of life, and that's what we're all about, really.
What about on the revenue side? You pride yourselves on holding down council tax and so on. clearly you feel you ought to have new revenue sources. Given you've got the 50 million of spending you're talking about, which doesn't produce a return from visitors, people, and whether people working here like me and most of my colleagues or tourists.
Yeah, there are multiple strands.
And of course we do, of course, pay substantial tax to you here as a property, but that's another
business
matter.
rates.
Yeah.
We don't get that.
Yeah. No, but I mean,
we collect it for you.
Yeah, you collect it, but you do get a.
Well, it's very.
I was going to say, do you want to have some of that?
I would love some of it. The business rates is quite an interesting matter.
Because Eric Pickles has.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that. Eric Pickles has launched this business rates reform, which supposedly links local authorities to their businesses to stimulate growth. That's fine if you've got brownfield and greenfield sites that you can build on, but it's very much linked to increasing floor space. If you're in a central urban area, there's very little that you can do to increase floor space. And we take the risk on appeals, so that when businesses don't like the rate, which have no control over the review of the rates, but when the businesses say they don't like it and appeal it, we take that risk, so that if they win the appeal, we take that loss, which actually means we are worse off under this business rate reform. And we're lobbying heavily and working with the CBI to potentially take a blank piece of paper and start looking at business rates again. We collect 1.8 billion, we receive 70 million, which is a drop of what we receive, and that's based on our grant as for our resident population.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. Yeah.
So we are lobbying for a change in the business rate, another change in the business rate regime. We are also very much behind Boris on his devolution agenda, and hopefully having monies and powers devolved to the GLA. And in fact, Westminster, on behalf of London councils, is leading with Central London 4, which is a central group of boroughs, on a growth deal through the London Enterprise Partnership, the Local Enterprise Partnership, very similar to the one that sort of Manchester and cities like that have got, which will then devolve money. We're looking particularly around skills and employment, which devolves money to groups of boroughs, well, first to the LEP and then to the groups of boroughs, which will be involved in getting people into work, payment by results, type of things. Well, so that will give us, if we win it, some more money. But I also think we have to look to our own assets. You know, what do we have that perhaps we could sweat a bit more? You know, advertising space, letting out floors in our building. We've, you know, contracted inside City Hall very significantly, and we're letting out floors, and there are all sorts of other. We're selling, our comms team are very successful at selling their services to other boroughs and other businesses, and so we're looking everywhere we can. You know, what do we have that's of value that we can raise revenue?
Good, thank you. Let's open it up to questions. We've got 2 mics around, so please ask your questions and identify who you are. Gentleman now.
Well, indeed, Najmal Hassan from Najmal Hassan, University of Greenwich Business School. My question is, well, thank you for your very enlightening presentation. What was the most difficult job you've had to do in your role as a council leader, one? And secondly, who is your role model and whom do you seek inspiration from in your work?
My role model has to be Margaret Thatcher, definitely. In terms of inspiration, I have inspiration from a whole variety of different people, depending on what aspect of my life I'm thinking about. And they're not always the obvious ones. In I think one of the greatest leaders this world has seen was King Hussein of Jordan, strangely enough, and you're probably all wondering why. And it's because he had he took over a country which had no natural assets at all, was very, very poor, right next door to Syria, which was a country which has a lot of natural assets, with the Palestinian crisis on his doorstep. And he managed to run his country in a way that was fair, that was prosperous, and without civil wars, despite taking in huge numbers of refugees. And that was a very difficult tightrope to walk. And I think someone who can manage all those different tensions in such a politically charged environment for the really genuine good of his people, whose quality of life was significantly better than many of the countries around, I think has to be one of the great leaders of his time. So, I mean, if I could be half of him, you know, I would be delighted. And then, of course, Simon Milton, who went before me. I mean, he's someone who I often look to because he's did my job before me. I often think, you know, gosh, he was a very great leader and sadly died way before his time, and I'm sure would have gone on to do very great things in national politics had he lived. And I often think to myself, you know, what would I do if, you know, what would he have done in my situation? I think so. There's sort of just two. I mean, I vary in my life, depending on, I sort of pick various different people. That's two very, very different people. In terms of the greatest challenge, interestingly enough, it probably was the election to be leader. It was actually, thankfully, a very fair fight. Colin Barrett stood down, and there was myself, and there was two other candidates, one very serious other candidate. What made it the biggest challenge was there were 48 people who were going to elect either me or my competitor, all of whom we both knew really quite well. So it wasn't like going to the election where you had thousands of people who didn't really know you very well, if at all. You know, these were people. It was a very personal vote, and that made it considerably harder, I think, than just about anything else I've done. Actually.
Interesting you mentioned Margaret Thatcher, someone who in a sense had relatively little time for local government.
I know, but she was a great leader. What I really admire about her was that she was a conviction politician. She did what she believed was right, even though it was uncomfortable. And to a degree in politics, I think we've shifted away from that. People are worried too much about their careers, saying the right thing, worried about the electorate thinking all the time, and therefore we don't necessarily see some of the strong decisions being taken. I'm not thinking of any particular political party or individual. I just think in general we've moved away from conviction politicians to more career politicians.
Gentleman,
Arif Zaman from the Commonwealth Business Council. I just want to ask a question. You talked a lot about the importance and opportunities for women coming into politics. I just wanted to share an observation and then ask a question. There is a debate emerging, I think, at a Commonwealth level. I'm thinking of the Women's Affairs Ministerial meeting a few months ago, where there was a debate around getting women onto public boards. So, you know, in a number of countries, and this may be true in London as well, you know, there have been a number of countries where, in places where there is economic reform taking place, there's a lot of restructuring going on. The opportunities for women to come into public boards directly, in fact, and actually getting experience of the public sector through that. Do you think there's a trade-off between that and going directly into politics, or do you see them as very, very different and not being mutually helpful or supportive?
I think they're mutually helpful and supportive. I think different women will want to do different things and have different skills, and there are enough good quality women to do both. So I would hope that women would be encouraged into both careers, and indeed overlap, because you can do one and then do the other, and vice versa. I think both are very important.
Right. We've got two at the front. Jill, yeah. Then thank you.
Hi, Peter mentioned that one or two of the people who worked here were also constituents, and I'm one of them. But I have to say, Philippa, I wouldn't have recognised you when you came in, even though I've lived in Westminster for 15 years. And I'm moderately interested. And I'm moderately interested.
My comms director.
And I'm moderately interested in politics or whatever. Of course, I get Westminster Reporter, which says it's sort of plastic bag, as do all the other ones, delivered to my flats. There is virtually no election campaign normally in Westminster, maybe one leaflet through the door during an election campaign. And I just wondered, you mentioned about, you know, relating to electors who you knew very well versus electors with whom you had very low profile. I just wondered what you thought generally should be done to maybe raise the level of interest and participation in local politics. Conversely, if Boris walked in, I fear, you know, I am probably, you know, 99.999% of people would recognise him. So I just wondered what your recipe was for raising interest in what, because actually Westminster in some ways matters more to me than London, but it has an incredibly low profile, I think.
So disappointing. Because I have to say, whereabouts do you live?
Bayswater.
Gosh, we've done a huge amount there.
You sent me a leaflet about little events. That's about the only communication I've had. And then you had to withdraw it.
Well, gosh, what you should have had by this stage in the campaign of probably about 5 leaflets.
I've had one call.
I'm surprised, actually. I will go back and look into it. In terms of my own profile, I mean, Boris obviously has a huge advantage and is on national television the whole time. I don't quite have the same pull as Boris has. But we have done a huge amount. I mean, I've been out, my first year was spent literally on the road around Westminster. I attended every area forum, residents association meeting, all the things that I could do to get out and about so that I could meet and hear from residents. I have been around Bayswater knocking on doors, talking to people on Saturday mornings and things. We do get a reasonable amount of press coverage and on television, which Julia coordinates for me, so I'll blame her. So, you know, we have done quite a lot. So I am shocked to find that you have had so little contact. We sent out the Westminster Reporter. There's always something from me in that, but you say that stays in its wrapper. But no, we have done an enormous amount.
But I think, I'm in a different borough. I take Jill's point that I'm in Camden, that actually for many Londoners, Boris, even though his actual responsibilities are quite narrow, really, does have that impact compared with with borough leaders of whatever kind. And I think it's particularly difficult in some of the inner London boroughs because the sense of community is much reduced.
30% churn every year.
And the churn and so on. And that actually the prominence of the leaders, for all you do, and it's not a question of what you do, in the sense that that's why I say there was something in the settlement of the creating a new mayor, which actually is slightly unfair to the boroughs and the borough leaders, and it's created a problem for you.
Well, I get back to your last question, did I feel competitive against Boris? Now I do. I hadn't before. Boris is a tremendous character, and he is Mayor of London, so he has a massive advantage in that he is going to be in the national press the whole time. The Evening Standard do carry quite a lot of stuff that on me and stuff, but the national newspapers very little because they cover the whole country, and actually most people, even in London, their source of information is actually the national media. So it is very hard for local politicians to get the profile. And it goes back to something I was saying in my speech about how we have female role models that are national politicians, but it's very hard because local politicians have so much lower profile, and it's not for the want of trying.
Yeah. No, I just think it's a paradox of the position. Lady there, yeah.
Hi, my name's Abigail. I'm Associate Director at Centre for London, which is a London-focused think tank. And my question, Philippa, is about the role that networks play in perhaps inhibiting or preventing women from being able to get into more influential positions, and I'm talking about particularly in senior management and in politics. And certainly in my context, I'm struck again and again by the fact that I'm living in a sort of 95 to 99% male-dominated, middle-aged to older male context, and the extent to which networks are a part of that is striking. So how can you encourage younger women in particular to help get into those positions and those situations so that they can actually present something of what they're able to do?
It's a very good point, and actually probably something I should have listed under the women's conference I talked about earlier, because that was the other thing that we found. Men in the institution just instinctively went out for a beer together. Whereas women tended to rush off home as fast as they could because they had other priorities. And therefore that sort of bonding that happened between men didn't happen in the same way, either between men and women or women together. And it's an incredibly difficult one to overcome because to a degree, to overcome it, you need to go against some of the instincts that you have. But I think it's incredibly important that women do recognise the importance of networks, because those networks and those buddies they made helped each other up the chain. So women need to recognise the importance of those networks, try as far as they are able to be part of the broader network with the men as well, though it is often hard because sometimes they go to places you don't want to go, but particularly in the city when I was there. So you could try and sort of be part of that, but also for women to work together and have their own networks. I think there's a sort of a bit of personal responsibility there that you need to sort of get out, with other women, not necessarily in your own institution, but in other similar institutions, and set up the own networks, because those networks are terribly important.
At the back.
Thank you. Sabine Mosner, Head of Strategy in DEFRA. If I could allow myself a follow-up as well as a new question. The follow-up is to your greatest challenge, which I thought was a really interesting example. Do you think that's harder for a woman to manage the sort of more small p politics than for a man? And what do you think about that? The substantive question is, about how we sell the importance of women in senior positions. There are some American neuroscientists now who argue that people respond much better to values-based arguments than rational arguments. And it was interesting when we were speaking earlier, you started out saying, you know, we ought to have more women in senior positions because it's fair. And then you spent quite a lot of time arguing why it's a proper thing to do and a rational thing to do, and it sort of would be better for the financial system. Would you like to comment on whether we, as senior women, feel it quite hard to sort of embrace the value-based arguments around women, you know, being equal with men, having a right to be in those positions, and we sort of tend to withdraw to the, you know, the more utilitarian arguments?
To your first point, the follow-up point about whether it was sort of harder for me or easier for me as a woman to deal with that small fee politics, I think it was both. I think it was harder in that being a woman, I was probably more sensitive to it, but easier because I was probably better at the small p politics. So if you see what I mean. So it's just being a woman is a double-edged sword, you know. So there's that. In terms of you know, the rational arguments for people versus the more sort of general arguments, I think the trouble is that women are breaking into male-dominated areas as they go up, and the arguments that go down better with men tend to be the more rational ones. You know, the fact that the Deloitte report says that you get 10% more return if you've got senior women, that's the sort of thing that goes tick, you know, with men. Okay, it must be good. Whereas if you, the examples I gave of my experience of being on boards and committees where the problem solving was better, it's far less easy to prove. And therefore one tends to fall back on the rational, logical, provable points because that's more easily accepted. And I'm not saying that's right, it's just where we end up. But I think hopefully over time, as more women get into more senior positions, we will be able to demonstrate the more less tangible benefits of women in senior positions, and that will become more and more accepted.
Two ladies along there, and then the gentleman in the front. But yeah, first you, then here. Yeah.
Hi, I work in the Cabinet Office, and I'm also a special constable with the Met, based in Westminster and in Soho. And so I was quite interested in what you were saying about focusing on the West End, and just wondered what you saw as the role of policing in that change.
Well, it's absolutely vital. I mean, the West End, unfortunately, is a bit of a crime hotspot, and one of the task groups you've got under the West End Partnership is looking at the nighttime experience, because a lot of the crime takes place at night, and looking at the type of nighttime economy that we've got and asking ourselves, is it the right one? I mean, we don't want to sanitise Soho in any shape or form because its attraction is that it's quite gritty. But there may be a bit more of a balance towards attracting people who haven't come for the hen night to get completely trolleyed and behave badly, and more towards someone who's come for the theatre and to have and go to the restaurants or to go to a nightclub or whatever, but not in that sort of, you know, binge drinking type of way. And then, but policing, we work very, very closely with the police in the way, in fact, across Westminster, but particularly in the West End, at trying to deal with some of the intractable crimes that go on there. I mean, there was, you're probably aware of the raids that they did recently in Soho. I mean, that was actually a phenomenal piece of work that, of a surveillance that went on for a couple of years using RCCTV, which was cracking down on an absolute hotspot of crime to do with drugs and stolen goods, where the criminals were doing their deals at one door, saying, you know, I want to buy these drugs, what the price was. They then go off literally in the same CCTV camera. You'd see them pinch the mobile phone. They then turn around and go and sell it in a brothel, and they come out with the money and go and buy the drugs. And it was all in a tiny, tiny area. And that's just one example of where the police really cracked down. They did these raids, they arrested all these people. And so we have to work really closely with the police in those areas. And then on the other end, the noise, there's sort of noise problems. There are 36,000 residents living in the West End that everybody forgets are there. And they have to go to sleep sometimes. And sometimes the noise and those sorts of issues, we need to work with the police on that. So it's a totally symbiotic relationship.
Alice Power, also from Cabinet Office. My question was, thank you very much for speaking, and you spoke very comprehensively about the issues kind of almost in institutions of attracting women into roles. I wonder, do you think it's a kind of an equivalent challenge or a greater challenge for also the public people in the public's perception of women in power, and whether there are different challenges faced with sort of, I don't know, persuading to people, whether it be by value or by logic, the importance of women, and kind of challenging those perceptions maybe by just your voters of the importance of women.
I think there are challenges, but I think the challenges are complex because they vary so greatly in generation and geographically. And therefore, the way you tackle them needs to vary. But I think the ultimate way of changing people's perceptions is good quality senior women doing great jobs. And then the more you see, the more women who get into those positions who do jobs, they are the ambassadors for all the rest of us, you know, to come along. So and that's going to be the real change, I think.
Thank you. Earlier on, you made it quite clear you didn't like the idea of quotas or women shortlists, but I did wonder, given that the nature of the local government has usually 3 councillors in a ward, whether or not there was some electoral advantage in having, as it were, a balanced approach, you know, say at least, you know, 1 man and 1 woman. Quite simply, either way, whatever your answer, what can we do to boost local government turnout? Because, as you know, it very rarely goes above 40%. And really, it is an insult to all those of you who work extremely hard for frequently little reward.
No, I quite agree with your point about turnout as a source of endless frustration. In fact, we in Westminster are having a campaign at the moment trying to encourage younger people to vote. If you can get them young, maybe they'll stay voting. But I think it's about education. I think people are turned off politics. They don't see it as relevant to their life. There's been scandals in the recent history which have put people off politicians. And I think we've got a long way to come back. And again, I think that's about education, and it's about good quality role models. In terms of wards having, you know, a mix, actually looking across Westminster, quite a few of our wards, I'm trying to think of all of them, but most of our wards do have a mix. And that's happened sort of naturally because the way the selection works, and maybe that's the ward committees, subliminally or not, thinking actually that they want a mix. I don't think it's something we need to force. Certainly in Westminster, it just seems to be happening.
But that's my experience. I mean, in my ward, it's in Richmond, got a former mayor and 2 cabinets, two females, one male. It works very well.
Right. We'll take a grouping since I see more hands coming up now. We'll take 3 together.
Yeah.
Nadine, then.
Hi, Nadine from the Institute for Government. There was a report by the Local Government Select Committee in January last year that actually said that one of the biggest deterrents for women going into local politics and becoming councillors was pay, and that local leaders had a duty to go out and actually promote the role better, but actually needed to. But that was always going to be the biggest barrier you were going to face. So women coming back to work, why would they go back for, you know, just so a few, a bit of an allowance when they could get proper pay in a corporation? And the second thing was you talked about going into Whitehall and having to talk to them about your problems as a council and trying to help them understand. Do you think that Whitehall fundamentally just doesn't get local government? And what's your view of them? And do you think that it might benefit them to be a bit, you know, to have some accountability like you do, where you have to be accountable for every pound that you spend and every decision that you make affects people directly and you have to answer for that? Do you think that they might benefit from that?
Right, well, we'll group them together, and the ladies there, and then a couple.
Thank you. Sue Charteris, Director of Equal Value. I can't imagine that you do, Philippa. I really enjoyed your presentation, but do you ever have a tantrum?
Right, we'll take those 2 together, then we'll take the two ladies. Yeah, we'll take you next. Yeah.
Firstly, on pay, it is a difficult one. This. I mean, we in Westminster really don't. We pay what everybody pays for a backbench councillor, but cabinet members and even me as leader, we don't get paid very much at all. And given we're in austerity times, it's very hard to change that. The amount of time that people put into being a councillor can sometimes be like a full-time job, but I think it's seen as more vocational. And that, rightly or wrongly, that is where we have ended up. What we don't have, we've got career officers. What we don't have is career, in inverted commas. Well, people obviously want to progress as a career, but we don't, you know, in terms of pay, have career councillors. And I think that is probably right, because I think if we did, we would attract different sorts of people who perhaps don't have that sense of wanting to put something back and make a change and help people's lives in the way that we do now. Because people have to do it vocationally because they don't get paid, whereas I think if people saw it as a job option, because they were paid as like a job, then it would attract a different sort of person, and I think that would be to the detriment of the quality of the type of person you attract into local government. Although I have to say I would like to be paid a bit more, but wouldn't we all?
Tantrum?
So the Whitehall local government. I think it depends on the departments. I think there are departments in Whitehall which have had career civil servants all the way through being promoted up who have not had much experience on the front line delivering services, or indeed in business or for healthcare or other areas which might be useful, and I think that's to the detriment. I do know that has been recognised, and that various Whitehall departments are now seconding people out or encouraging people to take a year or two out doing something different and coming back in again. The danger if people don't get that experience is that policy is then made in a vacuum without understanding the real implications and the difficulties of delivery on the ground, and that can have some really serious unintended consequences. So I think it is an issue. I think it is an issue that's hopefully starting to be recognised, and hopefully more and more we will see better, crossover between the two. In terms of the tantrum, I try always to remain very calm, and most of the times I achieve it. But occasionally behind closed doors I do scream, so yes, occasionally, yes.
I'll remember that question to think of which of our male speakers I should ask it of. I'll have to think who we've got in the next few weeks to do that. The two ladies there. And then you next, yep.
Josie Gluer, I'm the public sector lead at Morehouse Consulting. Two quick questions. Both centre on 15 years' time. What do you think the biggest challenge for council leaders such as yourself will be? And in 15 years' time, what do you think the biggest challenges for senior women in politics will be?
Right, and we'll also take the lady in front of you.
I was struck when you said that we need to see many great quality senior women doing great jobs, and contrasting that with your earlier comment about life in the city, where men went round claiming they did the deals and taking the credit for it even when they didn't. So again, a generalisation, but I think women are good at strategic coherence, doing the knitting, joining things up, making things work, and perhaps stand a bit more back when things go well and others claim credit. Generalisation. Plenty of men I know that do that too. And sometimes, men can be a little bit more forceful about their personal contribution. And I just wondered what advice you'd give to women in the room that may fall into the former category.
A challenge for local government in 15 years' time. I suspect we may be looking at a very different map in 15 years' time. I am not in a position to know what central government's view of what they would like local government to look like. But I think with the cuts that are coming through, there will have to be, or may well be, a consolidation of local authorities, particularly the smaller rural ones coming together. So I suspect that we will be looking at a far fewer number of local authorities across Britain, and I suspect we will see more joined up urban authorities, whether that will be the Manchester model where they've sort of come together, or whether it will be more GLA type models with and quite how local authorities that exist in places like London will work. I suspect that we will see more powers going to the group of the whole city. So I think the whole map will look quite different, and that is going to be very challenging in the transition. And I can't tell you how it's going to work because I don't think anybody knows. In terms of challenges for senior women, hopefully there will be significantly more of them. So the challenges for them will be very similar to the challenges that men face. They will just, there will be the challenges of the day, and there'll be hopefully 50% women, fingers crossed, or at least close to it, and therefore they won't be thinking about what is a challenge for me as a woman. They'll be thinking, what is a challenge for me in my role? And those will change. So what was the What's the the advice.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not necessarily gender, but it's more the characteristics of people that work collaboratively and soft influencing versus the...
I think we need to... Women, when a woman is asked a question, or I mean, I do it myself, about something, we don't tend to say, oh yes, I was brilliant at it, because we tend to feel slightly embarrassed about saying I was brilliant at it. So well, I think we need to gird our loins and just say it, because the men do. And if you've done something good, don't be embarrassed about telling people about it, because the men do. And that was certainly what I tried to learn at City when I saw people going around and saying how marvellous they were. Unfortunately, people listen to the people they can hear, and if you're not being heard, what can you do? I mean, you can't expect people to listen to you if you're not saying they're saying it. So I think, although one doesn't want to necessarily change one's personality to fit in with something, to some degree you have to just be more forceful and make sure your voice is heard as well.
On that, what a perfect note to end on. Could I thank you very much indeed, not only for your refreshing remarks, but also, clearly from the questions, you enthused people, inspired them and got them thinking, not only about the future of local government, I was very interested in the 15 years ahead, but also in the role of women in public life. Also, I'd like to thank again EY for sponsoring the series of Women's Leaders events, which is the 4th, and thank you for sparing the time to come. Thank you very much indeed.